A warm afternoon sun hung over the small town streets, and people walked in and out of shops, carrying bags or talking on their phones. Among them was a young black girl, no more than 12 years old, wearing a backpack that looked a little too heavy for her shoulders. She had just finished a school project at the library and decided to stop by a store on her way home. Her mother was often busy with work, and the girl had learned how to take care of herself for short errands. She was used to walking with confidence, though sometimes her small size made her look a little vulnerable. As she stepped out of the store, clutching a folder of papers against her chest, she noticed two police officers leaning against their patrol car on the corner. They were chatting casually, sipping coffee, and watching the people go by. When their eyes fell on her, one of them squinted and nudged the other. The girl didn't think much of it at first, but then she heard their footsteps as they started moving toward her. She slowed down, her heart beating a little faster, though she tried not to show it. "Hey, you there," one officer called, his voice sharp but not exactly kind. The girl stopped, turned slowly, and answered politely, "Yes, sir." She had been raised to speak with respect, no matter who she was talking to. The officer glanced at her backpack, then at her papers. "What are you carrying?" he asked. She held them up. "Just schoolwork. I came from the library." His partner chuckled softly, looking her up and down as though she had said something amusing. "Schoolwork, hey? You're out here alone?" he asked. The girl nodded. "Yes, sir. My house is close." The way they stared made her nervous. She wanted to walk away, but she also didn't want to seem rude or suspicious. One of the officers tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Where exactly do you live? Who's your guardian?" The girl swallowed, suddenly aware that people nearby were watching. A few shoppers slowed down, curious about what was happening. She clutched her folder tighter and replied, "I live near the park. My mom is at work right now." The officers exchanged glances. "And what does your mom do?" the first one asked with a smirk, as if he already doubted whatever answer she would give. The girl hesitated, knowing that whenever she mentioned her mother's real job, people often reacted with disbelief. Still, she was proud of her mom and never felt ashamed of saying it. Standing a little straighter, she answered firmly, "My mom is a general." For a moment, there was silence. Then both officers burst out laughing. The sound was harsh, echoing across the sidewalk. "A general," one of them repeated, holding his stomach as though it was the funniest joke he had heard all day. The other shook his head in disbelief. "That's a new one. You hear that? Her mom is a general. What's next? President." The girl's cheeks burned. She wished she could disappear, but she also didn't want to back down. She said again, quieter but still clear, "It's true. My mom is a general." Their laughter only grew louder. People passing by looked at the girl with mixed expressions. Some seemed sympathetic, others looked doubtful, and a few just kept walking, not wanting to get involved. The girl felt small under their gaze, but deep inside, she held on to the truth. She knew her mother's achievements. She had seen her put on the uniform every morning, had seen the medals displayed in their living room. She wasn't lying. But in that moment, surrounded by mocking voices, it felt like no one believed her. The taller officer crouched down slightly, still smirking. "Listen, kid, you don't have to make up stories. Nobody's mom around here is a general. You can just say she works at a store or an office or something." His words dripped with condescension, as if he thought he was being kind by giving her an easier lie to tell. The girl shook her head. "I'm not making it up," she insisted, her voice trembling just a little. "She really is a general." The second officer chuckled and looked around at the onlookers. "She's stubborn, I'll give her that," he said loudly, as if performing for the small audience that had gathered. "But come on. A general? That's a big imagination. His partner added, maybe she's watched too many movies. The girl felt her throat tighten. She wanted to cry, but she knew that would only make things worse. Her mother had always taught her to hold her head high, no matter who tried to bring her down. So she lifted her chin and repeated one more time, louder and with as much strength as she could gather, "My mom is a general. I'm telling the truth." Her eyes shone with determination, and though her voice shook slightly, it carried a weight that silenced the immediate laughter for just a second. That second stretched out, but then the mocking returned. The officers shook their heads, amused. One even tapped his partner on the arm and whispered something that made them both laugh again. The girl stood still, gripping her folder, refusing to move until they let her go. She could feel her heart pounding, but alongside the fear was a spark of pride. They could laugh all they wanted, but she knew who her mother was. That moment would stay with her forever, because while she stood there facing humiliation, she had no idea that the sound of a car pulling up at the curb would soon change everything. The girl stood frozen in place, her small fingers gripping the folder against her chest as though it could shield her from the laughter of the officers. Their mocking words rang in her ears, growing heavier with every passing second. The crowd of onlookers had thickened, and whispers passed from one person to another. Some people shook their heads with pity, others looked skeptical, and a few simply smiled uncomfortably, unwilling to step in. The girl's face felt hot, but she didn't look away. Her pride in her mother was stronger than the sting of humiliation. The taller officer leaned back on his heels, still smirking. "You're a stubborn kid," he said, pretending to admire her courage, though his voice carried only mockery. "You could just say your mom works in an office, or maybe she's a teacher. But a general? That's a stretch." His partner laughed again, shaking his head. She probably read about generals in a history book and thought it sounded impressive. Kids these days. Their words were meant to dismiss her, to make her story sound childish. The girl pressed her lips together, refusing to argue further. She had already said the truth, and she believed it didn't need defending. But the officers weren't done. One of them crossed his arms and stepped closer. "You know lying to the police isn't a good idea," he warned, his tone shifting from amused to stern. The girl's heartbeat quickened. She wasn't lying, and the idea of being accused of it frightened her. Still, she raised her chin and answered softly but firmly, "I'm not lying." The officer raised his eyebrows, clearly enjoying the drama. "Oh, really? Then why don't you tell us exactly what base she works at? What's her rank? Does she fly tanks or rockets too?" His sarcastic tone drew chuckles from a few people in the crowd. The girl blinked back tears. She could answer those questions. She knew her mother's rank, her division, and the base she commanded. She had visited it several times. But something inside told her not to share private details with strangers who clearly had no intention of believing her. Instead, she stood silent, her determination mixed with quiet fear. The second officer sighed loudly, pretending to be exasperated. "See? She can't even answer. That's because she's making it up." He turned toward the crowd, his voice carrying over the sidewalk. "Folks, we got ourselves a little storyteller here." Laughter rippled through a few bystanders. The girl's chest tightened, and her throat felt dry, but she didn't look down. She had learned from her mother that silence could sometimes be stronger than words. She just hoped that holding her ground would be enough. But the officers weren't satisfied. The taller one shook his head and muttered to his partner, "Maybe we should take her down to the station until her parents show up. That'll teach her not to make up stories." His partner nodded slightly, as if the idea was reasonable. The girl's stomach dropped. The thought of being taken to the station terrified her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she knew how it would look. She imagined the confusion, the paperwork, the phone calls, her mother's name being dragged into an unnecessary scene. She tried to speak again, her voice shaking. "My mom is a general." She's at work right now. She'll be here soon. The taller officer laughed outright. Oh, she'll be here soon? What's she going to do, march in with a whole army? His partner chuckled. Yeah, maybe she'll pull up in a tank. Their words stung, but the girl refused to cry. She thought of her mother's lessons, the stories she had told her about standing tall, about not letting anyone break her spirit. She remembered her mother's steady voice, saying, "The truth always stands on its own, no matter how many people try to laugh at it." That memory gave her strength. The crowd grew restless. A middle-aged woman in a blue dress stepped forward slightly, frowning at the officers. "She's just a child," the woman said softly. "Maybe you should let her go home." But the officers ignored her, their attention fixed on the girl. One bent down again, lowering his face close to hers. "Listen, kid. You're not going to keep this up. We'll drive you down, call your mom, and we'll see who shows up. And when it's not a general, you're going to regret wasting our time." His words were sharp, but the girl didn't flinch. She only repeated, "She is a general." Something in her steady gaze gave even the mocking officer a brief pause. For a split second, his smirk faltered. But then he laughed again, brushing it off. "Fine, fine," he said, straightening up. "We'll wait and see." His partner leaned against the car again, sipping what was left of his coffee, shaking his head as if the whole thing was a silly joke. The girl stood silently, clutching her papers tighter, her feet firmly planted on the sidewalk. People whispered around her, some starting to believe she wasn't going to back down. Minutes stretched on, heavy with tension. The girl's heart raced, but she kept reminding herself that her mother would not let her down. She had faith that the truth would soon speak louder than all the laughter. Then, in the distance, she heard the low hum of a vehicle approaching. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the traffic, but she recognized the sound. It was the kind of car she had ridden in with her mother many times before. Her pulse quickened, not with fear this time, but with a rush of hope. The officers didn't notice at first. They were still chuckling to each other, shaking their heads at the situation. But the girl's eyes lit up, her breath catching in her throat as the black SUV rolled closer and finally stopped near the curb. The crowd began to murmur again, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she lowered her folder, her eyes fixed on the car door that was about to open. She knew exactly who was inside. And she knew that in just a moment, the mocking would end, and the truth would stand tall before everyone. The black SUV came to a slow stop at the edge of the sidewalk, and the noise of its engine immediately drew the attention of the crowd. People who had been whispering now turned their heads, curious to see who had arrived. The girl's heart beat faster as her eyes stayed locked on the car. She recognized the familiar license plate, the tinted windows, and even the way the driver parked neatly and confidently. A wave of relief washed over her. She knew this was not just another car. This was her mother's vehicle. The officers glanced at it too but didn't seem impressed. One of them muttered, "Probably just some parent coming to pick her up." His partner smirked, sipping the last of his coffee. "Yeah, let's see what kind of general walks out of that thing." Their sarcasm was still heavy, and they didn't believe a single word the girl had said. They were already preparing themselves for a good laugh when the truth would supposedly be revealed. The SUV's door opened with a quiet click. A tall figure stepped out, the sun glinting off polished shoes first, then the sharp crease of a military uniform. The woman who emerged carried herself with an air of authority that immediately commanded respect. Her posture was perfect, her stride strong, and the insignia on her uniform shone clearly in the light. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as recognition began to ripple through them. This was not just any woman. This was someone who had worked years to earn a position very few people ever reached. She was indeed a general. The girl's eyes lit up with pride. She wanted to run to her mother instantly, but she held her ground, waiting for her mother to reach her. The officers, meanwhile, suddenly grew quiet. The smirks faded just slightly, though one of them tried to keep up his act. "Well, well," he said under his breath, "someone sure likes to play dress up." But the tone of his voice carried less certainty now. There was something about the woman's presence that was difficult to ignore. The general walked steadily toward the group. Each step she took seemed to make the atmosphere heavier. The crowd fell into near silence, watching intently. The girl's mother didn't speak at first, she only looked around, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She noticed her daughter standing still, her papers clutched tightly, and she noticed the officers beside her, their laughter now gone. Without hesitation, the girl straightened her back and raised her hand in a crisp salute, just as her mother had taught her. "Ma'am," she said clearly, her voice trembling only slightly from emotion. The general's eyes softened for a moment as she returned the salute. Then she placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "At ease," she said, her voice firm but warm. The girl lowered her hand, relief flooding her heart. She was no longer alone. The truth had arrived, and it stood beside her in full uniform. The officers shuffled uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat, trying to regain his confidence. Excuse me, ma'am," he said, attempting politeness. "We were just checking on the girl here. She told us, well, she said you were a general. We thought she might be making things up." His words stumbled, and his earlier arrogance was gone. His partner tried to add, "Yeah, you know how kids exaggerate sometimes. We didn't mean any harm." But their excuses sounded thin in the heavy silence. The general's eyes fixed on them, sharp and unwavering. "You thought she was lying," she said flatly, her tone calm but carrying undeniable authority. The officers glanced at each other, caught off guard. One tried to laugh nervously. "Well, yes, ma'am. It sounded a little far-fetched, you know. Kids don't usually have parents in such high positions." The general didn't smile. "So instead of listening with respect, you mocked her in public? You laughed at her and made her feel small." Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that pressed down on the entire street. The officers had no good reply. Their earlier boldness had vanished, and they shifted uneasily under her gaze. The crowd watched closely, some nodding with approval at the general's words. The girl, standing by her mother's side, felt a swell of pride so strong it erased the sting of the humiliation she had endured moments before. One officer finally muttered, "We didn't mean anything by it, ma'am. Just a little misunderstanding." But the general shook her head slowly. "Respect is not optional," she said firmly. "Especially from those who wear a uniform. It doesn't matter if she is a child, a stranger, or the daughter of a general. You do not humiliate the people you are meant to protect." Her words struck deep, not just at the officers but at everyone listening. The message was clear: dignity and respect should never be denied to anyone. The girl's eyes glistened with admiration. She had seen her mother in uniform before, but watching her command respect in this moment was different. It wasn't just about the badges or the rank. It was about the strength of character, the sense of justice, and the way her mother stood tall even when others tried to diminish her. That was what truly made her a general. The officers finally bowed their heads slightly, mumbling apologies. Their arrogance had crumbled. They realized they had underestimated not only the child but also the truth she carried. The crowd around them began to murmur again, this time with admiration for the girl and her mother. Some even clapped softly, as if to show their support. The girl leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "I told them the truth." Her mother's stern expression softened into a proud smile. "I know you did," she whispered back. "And you stood your ground. That's what matters." The warmth in her voice wrapped around the girl like a shield, stronger than any mocking words could ever be. The general turned back to the officers one last time. "Remember this," she said firmly. Every person deserves respect, no matter their background, their age, or their words. When you laugh at someone for telling the truth, you reveal more about yourself than about them. The officers nodded quietly, their earlier confidence completely gone. They knew this moment would follow them for a long time. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but many lingered, whispering about what they had just witnessed. A child's honesty, doubted and mocked, had been proven in the most powerful way possible. The girl and her mother stood together, side by side, a picture of truth and dignity. For the girl, it was a moment she would never forget. She had felt the weight of humiliation, but she had also felt the power of standing tall and being proven right. More than that, she had felt the pride of being the daughter of someone who truly embodied strength and honor. As the general placed a gentle hand on her daughter's back and guided her toward the car, the girl glanced back once more at the officers. They avoided her gaze, ashamed of their actions. And though she did not smile, her eyes shone with quiet triumph. She had endured their mockery, and now the truth stood taller than their laughter ever could. The air around the group seemed heavy as the general's presence settled over the sidewalk. The crowd that had gathered no longer whispered with doubt but with awe. People glanced at one another, their eyes wide, as if they had just witnessed something out of a movie. The little girl stood quietly beside her mother, her small shoulders squared with pride. She had endured their laughter, but now, with her mother at her side, she felt taller than ever. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They were no longer laughing, no longer smirking. Their earlier arrogance had dissolved under the firm gaze of the general. She stood calm but powerful, her voice even as she spoke again. When a child tells you something, it is not your place to laugh. It is your place to listen. Especially when you wear the badge of responsibility. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. One of the officers opened his mouth to reply, but the words faltered. His partner nudged him slightly, urging him to say something. At last, he muttered, We didn't realize she was telling the truth, ma'am. We thought it was just a story." The general tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "And so you mocked her? That was your answer? You decided it was easier to laugh at a child than to give her the dignity of being believed." The shame on their faces was clear. The crowd began to murmur in agreement, a few shaking their heads at the officers. The girl's chest swelled with a strange mix of emotions. She was still stung by the memory of their laughter, but she felt comfort in her mother's steady presence. She thought of all the times her mom had told her, "The world will test your truth. Sometimes people won't believe you until they are forced to see it. But you must never stop standing tall." Now, those words echoed in her heart, stronger than ever. The general stepped closer to the officers, her boots clicking against the pavement. The sound was small, but in the silence, it carried weight. She stopped only a few feet away from them. "You hold authority," she said firmly. "That authority comes with power, but also with responsibility. When you misuse it even with something as simple as laughter, you damage the trust you are sworn to protect." The officers bowed their heads. Their earlier mocking expressions had completely vanished. One of them spoke softly, "We're sorry, ma'am. We didn't mean to disrespect her." The general's expression remained steady. "Respect should not depend on who someone is related to. You did not know she was my daughter. And yet, you laughed at her anyway. That speaks more about your judgment than about her words." The officers winced at the truth in her statement. The crowd grew more vocal now. Some people nodded, a few clapped softly, and others whispered that the officers had been caught in their own arrogance. A young man standing nearby pulled out his phone, recording the scene. Not for drama, but because he felt the moment carried an important lesson worth remembering. The little girl looked up at her mother with shining eyes. To her, this was not just her mom in uniform. This was her protector, her hero, the woman who always told her to hold her head high. Watching her command respect so effortlessly filled the girl with awe. She whispered softly, "Mom, I didn't cry. Her mother glanced down at her with a brief smile, her eyes warm for a moment. I know, she whispered back. You stood strong. I'm proud of you. The officers shuffled their feet, realizing they were now the center of everyone's judgment. The taller one cleared his throat again. We'll do better, ma'am, he said quietly. His partner nodded quickly, adding, it won't happen again. The general's gaze remained firm. It must not happen again, she corrected. Every person deserves dignity. Whether they are a child, a stranger, or someone in uniform. If you cannot uphold that, you do not deserve to wear the badge. Her words struck them harder than anything else could have. They lowered their eyes, ashamed, realizing this moment would follow them long after the crowd dispersed. The general turned to her daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Come, she said softly. You've already proven your strength today. You don't need to prove it any further. The girl nodded, though she couldn't help but glance at the crowd. Many people were smiling at her now, not with pity, but with respect. As the two of them began to walk back toward the SUV, the crowd parted to let them through. People whispered words like brave, strong, and honorable. The girl heard them, and each word felt like a bandage on the hurt she had carried only moments earlier. She stepped carefully beside her mother, her head held high. But just as they reached the car, the general paused and turned back toward the officers. Her voice carried across the sidewalk, clear and firm. This will not be forgotten. Learn from it. Grow from it. Because the next time you stand in front of someone smaller, weaker, or younger, remember today. Remember that you once laughed at the truth and were silenced by it. The officers nodded quickly, their faces red with shame. They knew she was right. The girl climbed into the SUV, setting her folder down on the seat beside her. She watched through the window as her mother gave one last firm look at the crowd, then joined her inside. The car doors closed, and the noise of the outside world grew muffled. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the girl staring at her mother's sharp uniform and the strong lines of her face. At last, she spoke. I didn't think you'd come right then, she admitted softly. The general turned to her with a smile that melted the sternness from her face. I will always come, she said gently. No matter where you are, no matter what happens, I will always stand with you. Tears welled in the girl's eyes, but this time they were not from shame. They were from pride and love. She leaned against her mother, resting her head on her shoulder. The SUV began to roll forward, leaving the crowd, the officers, and the scene behind. But the lesson of that day lingered in the air, carried in the whispers of the people who had witnessed it. They would remember the little girl who told the truth, the officers who mocked her, and the general who walked in to prove her right. For the girl, it was a moment etched forever in her memory. It had hurt, but it had also shown her the strength that lived within her, the strength her mother had passed down. As the car drove on, the little girl whispered one more time, almost to herself, she really is a general. And for the first time that day, her words were met with no laughter, only the quiet comfort of knowing the world had finally seen the truth. The drive away from the scene was quiet at first. The girl sat in the back seat, her eyes staring out of the window as the streets passed by. The tension in her chest began to loosen, but the memory of the officer's laughter still echoed in her ears. She pressed her hands together in her lap, feeling both relief and pride. She had told the truth, and even though no one believed her at first, the truth had stood firm in the end. Her mother glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She could see the girl's thoughtful expression. After a few moments, she spoke gently. You were very brave today. The girl looked up, her eyes meeting her mother's in the mirror. I didn't feel brave, she admitted softly. I felt embarrassed. The general nodded slowly. Bravery is not about feeling no fear or shame. Bravery is about standing even when you do. Her words settled into the girl's heart, giving her comfort. The girl leaned back against the seat, thinking about what had happened. The officers had laughed, the crowd had doubted, but she had not backed down. She had repeated her truth, even when her voice trembled. And in the end, the world had seen it. She realized that her mother was right. Courage was not about being fearless. It was about holding on when fear tried to knock you down. By the time they reached home, the girl felt calmer. Their house was quiet and peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the street. She placed her school folder on the table and sat down heavily on the couch. Her mother sat beside her, removing her hat and setting it gently on the table. For a moment, they just sat in silence. Finally, the girl asked, "Did I do the right thing? Should I have just kept quiet?" Her mother turned to her, her face softening. "You did exactly the right thing," she said firmly. "When someone doubts your truth, it is not your job to change it into something easier for them to believe. Your job is to keep standing. The truth doesn't need decoration. It doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be held." The girl nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. A small smile touched her lips. The next day, whispers of what had happened spread through the town. People who had been in the crowd shared the story with others. Some said they admired the little girl for her courage. Others said the officers had learned a hard but necessary lesson. A few even admitted they had doubted the girl at first, only to be surprised when the general arrived. The story became something people talked about in shops, at bus stops, and even in classrooms. At school, the girl noticed that her classmates looked at her differently. Some came up to her and asked if it was true, if her mother was really a general. She answered simply, "Yes, she is." There was no prideful boasting in her tone, only calm truth. A few of her friends smiled with admiration. "That's amazing," one of them said. The girl felt her cheeks warm, but this time it was from pride rather than shame. Meanwhile, the officers who had mocked her found themselves facing consequences. Their supervisors had heard about the incident, not only from the general herself but also from the crowd's recordings and complaints. The two men were called in for a meeting, where they were reminded about the importance of respect and the seriousness of their roles. They were embarrassed, but the lesson was clear: they could not let their positions make them careless with their words. The girl never saw those officers again, but she knew deep down that the encounter had changed them. She hoped they would remember the moment whenever they were tempted to laugh at someone weaker or younger. She hoped they would choose respect next time, instead of mockery. One evening, a week later, the girl sat on the porch with her mother. The sky was painted with orange and pink from the setting sun. She turned to her mother and asked, "Why do people laugh at things they don't believe?" Her mother thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes, people laugh because it's easier than admitting they don't understand. Sometimes, they laugh because they feel powerful when someone else feels small. But laughter like that doesn't last. The truth always stands longer." The girl considered this carefully. "So, the truth is stronger than their laughter?" she asked. Her mother smiled softly. "Always." That night, the girl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She replayed the moment when the officers had laughed, and then the moment her mother had stepped out of the SUV. The difference between the two moments was vast. One filled her with shame, the other with pride. But she realized something important: even before her mother had arrived, she had already stood strong. She had not run away, she had not changed her words. She had stood with the truth. That thought made her heart feel lighter. As weeks passed, the story of that day faded from daily gossip, but it never faded from the girl's memory. It became a piece of her identity, a reminder of her strength. Whenever she felt nervous or doubted, she thought of the moment she raised her chin and said, "My mom is a general," despite the laughter. Her relationship with her mother grew even stronger after that day. The general often reminded her daughter that strength was not measured by size, age, or even rank, but by the courage to hold the truth. The girl listened carefully, storing each word like a treasure. She knew she would need them one day, when life tested her again. Years later, when she thought back to that afternoon outside the store, she no longer remembered only the sting of humiliation. She remembered the lesson it carried. She remembered the warmth of her mother's hand on her shoulder, the pride in her eyes, and the strength of standing tall. It was a moment that shaped her, giving her a quiet confidence that stayed with her long after the laughter had ended. And for the officers, that day was also remembered. Whenever they walked the streets, some people still glanced at them knowingly, as if reminding them of the mistake they had made. Though it was uncomfortable, it kept them accountable. It reminded them that authority was not a shield to hide behind, but a responsibility to carry with humility. The girl never needed to prove herself again. Whenever she walked through town, she carried herself with quiet dignity, no matter who doubted her. The lesson she had learned was simple but powerful: truth, once spoken, did not vanish, even if others laughed. Truth had a way of shining through, like light breaking through clouds. And so, her life moved forward, built on that strength. She continued to grow, to learn, and to carry her mother's wisdom. And whenever someone questioned her, she no longer felt the sting of doubt. She remembered that day, and she smiled to herself, knowing she had already faced the laughter of disbelief and come out stronger.